From the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books 2016, this is Outside the Book, as we take you beyond those chapters, beyond the hardcover, and get to know our authors just a little bit. Joining us right now, author-illustrator M.D. Payne. Thank you for joining us.
Such a pleasure to be here.
You have some really interesting books. You talk a lot about monsters.
Yeah, I always had this crazy idea of how funny would it be if you went into a monster retirement home. What would that be like? What are old monsters like? And it just seemed to me like such a funny concept that kids would really get a kick out of. So I had this kernel of an idea and thought, okay, well, now I have the idea, what do I do with it? And I decided that the reason the monsters were so old, and the poor vampire's dentures are falling out and the werewolf's fur is coming out in chunks, and is because there's newer monsters on the scene that are even more terrifying than they are, that are draining them of their monster juice. And now it's up to them and a group of kids to save the day. So now these kids who are actually helping at the retirement home have to help the monsters defeat these new super enemies. And it ends up being, though the book itself is very silly and disgusting, we have a lot of like potty humor, and it's very like Captain Underpants in the sense that it embraces, the 8-year-old boy sensibility. It is a story about friendship, this really wacky friendship between the kids and these old people.
When you're talking about writing about old people and then incorporating children into the mix, you have to almost get into that mindset, don't you? How do you write for that audience?
It's interesting, writing for that age group, there's certain limitations, of course, because we're talking about readers who have just begun. And so you can't use, not even complex words too often, but complex sentences or even complex story ideas. So it is, as an author, very limiting to try to get down to how do I describe something in a way that's really going to pull this reader in, this reader who this may be their first book, their first real book. At the same time, because I'm writing for 8 to 12-year-olds, I get a certain toolbox that other authors don't have. I get to make really funny jokes about, pardon me, I don't know if I can say this on PBS, but farts and burps, and in a way that really hits with the audience, that if I were writing stuff like that for adults, they would, laugh me out of the room. But like, this is stuff that's really attracting kids to the page and then glues them in there for the more complex word or sentence that they didn't think that they were going to read.
You said something just a minute ago that this could be their first book. Now, I know you know your first book. You remember what your first book was because it makes such an impression on a young mind. What's that feel like to have, I'm not going to call it a burden because it's a beautiful opportunity, but to have that responsibility?
Yeah, I think for me that's why I write for kids as opposed to adults. The idea that this is so new to them and you're connecting to them in a way that it's just so unique. Some of the kids from last year, I came here last year, and a few of them came back and were like, oh, I read all your books. And I was like, first I was like, okay, how was it? Obviously they wouldn't have come over and got excited if they didn't like it, but they're like, oh yeah, it was great, and this was my favorite part. And so to see that reaction, that not only were they reading it, but it was really making an impression is really a thrill.
Now, we talk about the written word, and you talked about that, but the visuals. The current cohort of youngsters they're inundated with visual stimulation all the time. So how do you go about deciding what your visuals are going to look like to capture that reader?
It's interesting. I think you said author-illustrator. I actually work with an illustrator by the name of Keith Zhu. And what's fun, though, is I get to, I don't know if the camera can see this, but this cover here, basically, they ask me, what are you thinking about with this book? This was book number 5. I was in the middle of wrapping up book number 3. And outlining book 4, but they needed to know for the cover enough about the 5th book so they could make a cover for it. And I'm like, I know it's going to be in Egypt, so we need some pyramids in the background, and I want to bring in a serpapard, which is an ancient Mesopotamian Babylonian creature, and he's going to be holding a brain up to a bunch of scarabs, and then I get this.
And your illustrator says,
and he does it, and it's fantastic to have that kind of like wild imagination be able to put visually. And I think the covers are one of the big draws of the book for sure, and that kids, again, if we're talking about kids who this may be the first book they've read, they're not necessarily going to flip inside and catch a few lines to decide whether they want to read it or not. The cover is very important, and I think Keith has done a great job with these, for sure.
As well as the author, M.D. Payne, who we've been talking about, because he writes stomach-turning tales of terror. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We've been talking with author Matt M.D. Payne.